Support for Digging Deeper comes from the Penn State Alumni Association, connecting alumni to the university and to each other. The Alumni Association is powered by pride. Learn more at alumni.psu.edu. And from viewers like you, thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrew Destin. Global climate change is an issue that affects us all, but what can we do about it and what is being done here at Penn State? On this episode of Digging Deeper, Penn State President Eric Barron talks to Bruce Logan, Director of the Engineering, Energy, and Environment Institute, and Erica Smithwick, Distinguished Professor of Geography.
Well, welcome. I really appreciate the two of you joining me for a discussion about climate change. It is sort of back in the news with a kind of a renewed interest when you have Portland hit over 100 degrees and fires and too much rain in part of the country. So I know the interest is growing, and then along comes the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which has significant warnings. So from the two of you, what is your view? Can we wrestle this to the ground, or are we going to see a lot more impact?
We're going to see a lot more impact.
A lot more impact.
There's no question about this.
It's too late.
It would have been nice to do this, have this conversation 10 or 20 years ago, when really it was not too late.
Yeah.
But we're certainly at the point where a lot of things are happening which are irreversible. And people, when they hear it may be 3 degrees warmer, they don't really have a sense of urgency about that. And that's really difficult, I think. I think that's one of the biggest problems, is they don't see the urgency. I mean, finally they are, because states are burning up and countries are burning up and temperatures getting warm.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that. I mean, I think there are a couple things that came out of that recent assessment report that are worth noting. The first is that those extremes of drought and high extreme temperatures and flooding are likely to become more extreme. Droughts may double in frequency. So if it happened once every 10 years, it might happen once every 2 years, for example. And same with extremes in temperature and flooding. So that really comes out of this recent assessment, that those extremes, and we now have the data to really reinforce that prediction. But the other piece, which has at least a slightly more optimistic spin to it, is that they did conclude in that report that we are somewhat locked in to some of these changes, as Bruce was just describing, up to the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius if we continue on current trends, but that there was an opportunity to help us avoid the worst beyond that. And that's what really we worry about, right? So some of this is going to happen, and we're baked in quite literally to some of those changes. But we also have the opportunity to prevent the worst case scenario. And I think that's where we're at right now.
There's two really interesting parts of this. One, if you say the world will warm by 1 or 2 degrees, the average person has a hard time seeing that as anything that is serious.
Yeah.
And the other part about it is you even with the cautionary statements that have been made for quite a bit of time, that when you have variability superimposed upon this trend, you'll still have some years that might be cooler than average. And so how much does this discussion all of a sudden go away if next year proves to be a cool year?
I'll say I don't think so, because it's not going to be uniformly cool around the world. I mean, when one area gets cold, another area is getting blazingly hot. But even that degree change, as you were saying, most people don't appreciate 1.5 or 2 degrees C, but it's degrees Celsius, and the ranges could be 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius if we don't stop things. That translates to 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And land temperatures, as you probably know, are 50% higher on average than the global average. And so you're looking at State College in August might be 80 usually, 90 could be average, with episodes into the hundreds, the low hundreds. That's not off the chart. And I think that doesn't get communicated enough. I think the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees makes people feel kind of, well, a little bit warmer winter. That wouldn't be so bad, would it?
Yeah, I agree. At Siberia, a little warming would really work out well. But so, one of the things that we're always doing in this space is talking about temperature, and the drought and rainfall issue has come to the fore. What other serious consequences are you seeing that might occur if we're not taking more effort to slow emissions?
If we just brought this home to Pennsylvania, some of the reports that have been done regionally suggest that there could be large impacts on a number of important sectors in our economy. So, for example, to agriculture, dairy cattle are predicted to produce less milk, and dairy is one of our top industries. There are likely to be more pests and pathogens on things like apples and Concord grapes, also important to our agricultural systems. So I think some of those threats are likely to amplify in the future, and even on our natural systems, on our forests, likely to see more diseases of our trees, and couple that with more invasive species. They're just kind of getting hit on all sides. So I think when you look around the Pennsylvania landscape, some of these changes are likely to be, people can notice them in their pocketbook, if nothing else.
Even it doesn't take too many years of off temperature before you put an awful lot of agriculture perhaps at risk, or in terms of invasive species or pests to put things at risk. Although, I should tell you a story that I had a lot of students who were looking at what might happen, not just from a temperature viewpoint. And I talked about shifting of oats northward, or shifting of lobsters so that you wouldn't necessarily have a Maine lobster. You'd have a Newfoundland. And one of the students said, I've never known where my Cheerios are coming from. Why do I care in the future where my Cheerios are coming from? So do you think that is a factor? I mean, Erica, you just described a significant impact on agriculture in the state of Pennsylvania, when this is one of our major economic factors in the state. Do we need to care, or does it just mean we'll get to grow peaches?
Well, some people are going to be impacted. Some people aren't going to be impacted. Some people will care, and some people won't care. I will say that, I work in my own research with indigenous peoples who, are really connected to place and land, and you can't move, that culture doesn't move. That sense of place doesn't move with the climate. And so for some communities, these are going to be changes that are profoundly transformative. You're right that I think, where the Cheerios comes from is going to shift, and a lot of people won't notice that. But I think that there's a role for larger, for society as a whole to help, adjust to those changes and make sure that they're less painful, so that person doesn't matter where the Cheerios come from.
And I think the other side of this too is, that's what those are all the bad things that can happen. The question is, can we stop those things from happening? And what are the really difficult things in this scenario? I mean, our food system is about 25% of the energy consumed in the U.S. Changing that food system can't be easy. The steel production and concrete production is like 15% of global energy, and so maybe that person doesn't know where their Cheerios comes from, but they probably should start to figure it out.
Yeah, well, I must admit, I answered that, unless you're willing to ship soil to the hard rock part of Canada, it won't work anyway because the soil is tuned to the climate, not just the plants and animals. And it takes a long time to build a soil base. So what are the potential things that are most likely to help us mitigate this as a problem so that we're not seeing the most serious consequences, which is wholesale changes in water economies, agriculture in particular, forestry changing.
Yeah,
What are options?
There's the engineering solutions, okay, informed science to engineering changes, and then there's the natural habitat, the ecosystems that exist, and I should say Erica should probably talk about just the forest system and that aspect because it's so central to what she does, and I'll come back with the engineered part.
Okay, let's do it.
Sure. So there's a lot we can do by not doing anything in a way, right? By protecting the forests that we have and not extracting them and making sure that they are healthy ecosystems. And then restoring those places where they used to be. And what that does is it, absorbs the carbon out of the atmosphere, keeps it locked in, and kind of buffers us for a while against some of these other emissions while those engineering solutions come at pace. So that's one thing. We call those offsets. And those can help our balance books in the short term, but are not likely to get us out of this problem right now. And that's where we really will need some of these more engineered solutions, which, by the way, also are associated with things that photosynthesize. So we can use biomass in biofuels to fuel our energy in some places where appropriate, integrate that into our agricultural systems and have that, our own research has shown that can be a carbon positive solution. So we can use nature in positive ways to help us navigate through some of those more tricky technical solutions and policy solutions.
So if you go back 10 or 15 years, maybe it's longer and getting a little older. There were even videos on the greening of the planet because of CO2 fertilization. And so you're actually describing a kind of greening in some ways, but you view it as a temporary offset.
Well, some science has shown that even if you were to green the entire planet, let's just pretend hypothetically that every part of the planet could get forested, the math doesn't work out. You still are not going to get to net zero and sort of start drawing down the carbon that's already out of the atmosphere. Now, there may be lots of other co-benefits of having more forested regions across the world for biodiversity, for water quality. There's lots of reasons to do that. There's also lots of sort of social reasons why we wouldn't want to do that. So there's going to be a limit to what we can green and where we can green it. And of course, trees are slow in terms of growing up the biomass that they would need to make a difference. And, I love trees and I think they're a huge part of the solution, but we need other strategies behind that as well.
Yeah, and of course, drought also, where the drought is also must limit that in some ways.
Exactly.
So Bruce, the engineering solution.
Well, I'll put a number first on the trees. It's about 15 trees just to take up the CO2 that we exhale. And then if you add in all the CO2 that we use as an average American, it's like 750 trees and, 5 or 7 acres of trees. That's why it doesn't work. You just can't have enough trees. So what we have to do is be more active in what we do. And we basically spent 100 years building up our whole industry on fossil fuels. So the obvious first step is don't do that. Use renewables. And we're at a crossroads. We're actually getting about as much electricity from coal now as we do renewables, but the coal is going down and the natural gas consumption's going up. And that's kind of a mixed blessing. Natural gas has about half the inherent amount of carbon as coal. So every time we take a little bit more coal out of the system, we're really impacting those CO2 emissions. But eventually you get down to where you have renewables and you have natural gas, and that really gets to be the hard part because we're depending on that natural gas to kind of keep our electricity and everything else running. So we have to be smart about how we capture it out of flue gas and really how we build the battery and storage system to integrate with all those intermittent energy sources like solar and wind and things like that. So it comes to a really hard part. We can cut our emissions by half. I think that's really doable, very, very doable. That other half gets really hard to engineer.
And if I could add one more thing too, I mean, there's another sector of the solution space, which is social, right? And working with communities, working with individuals, working with government and policy. That has to be, as much as I'm trained as a natural scientist, I increasingly engage with the social sciences because that's where the work really needs to be done. So even if we had the technologies and the math on the table to make these things sound good, they really need to be implemented at scale. And that means partnerships with industry and government and universities and communities.
So both of you have prompted a different set of questions. I would have gone back a bit of time and said that the battery technology is not there, but with the rate that electric cars are going, and I've got a solar on the roof of a van that powers batteries, and it lasts for days, it seems. So perhaps this part has changed considerably. What about scrubbing and drawdown of carbon? Is the engineering of that moving quickly in a positive way?
Bruce, that's all you.
Yeah, it is not moving fast enough. And it's a tough problem. I mean, you're basically taking up a little bit of oil out of the ground or something that's very compact and dense and turning it into, a very diffuse CO2. And then you got to kind of squeeze it back all together and shove it back in the ground. That is a really difficult problem. We can do it. There's no question about it. But if it adds another 25% of electricity generation to do that, and really increases the cost, then it doesn't become feasible. So it's a huge challenge. I think, at Penn State, we've got some people that are doing some good work in that, how does it move in the ground? How do we keep it in the ground? Can we keep it in the ground? But how do we get it out economically and effectively put it down in the ground? It's a necessary component of every climate change solution is doing something to get that carbon into the ground.
Yeah. So, and then let me go back to the social science component of this, because I have been struck that we have a society that doesn't necessarily trust science the way they should. And in my opinion, as someone who's a scientist, but also almost everything they read has, this is happening, but so-and-so believes the opposite. And so how much of this is really a communication problem as well as a behavioral problem?
I mean, it is both, right? I think, and we need to keep educating and we need to keep talking about it. And Katherine Hayhoe, a famous climate change communicator, would say we need to talk to our peers, right? And trust, we trust who we are near to and who we talk to regularly. So using networks, maybe outside the networks that we're currently talking with, to help that communication. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for us. A lot of the times I feel like we're speaking to the choir and we're not reaching the audiences that we really want to reach. But I think part of that is really seeing where people are at, right? And people want to put food on their table. They are looking at job security. They're looking at health issues. And the truth is that climate touches all of those things, right? We can provide jobs through the renewable sector. We can provide more healthy environments for our children by addressing climate change. So pivoting the conversation away from the doom and gloom, like as we just started this conversation, and as normally one starts that conversation, to one where we can really start engaging from a different starting point.
Yeah, I've often thought having this sort of get personal to look at some of the issues that affect individuals more in regions has a lot of power, but I think that sort of lagged behind in the last decade in terms of what science is capable of. So what should Penn State do? And in particular, sort of thinking about that we could do some things where we have to raise tuition in order to do it. And we can do a lot of things where perhaps not. So what should Penn State do?
Well, there's the physical infrastructure, and as you know, we're already doing a lot in that space, right? With the BP light source solar farms, and with switching from coal to natural gas. You know, we can go and we can set an example. That's good. But we have to really dig into the root of the problem, and that becomes through education and research. We've got to get this information into our classrooms. I mean, a lot of students have no concept what a kilowatt hour is, or what that means relative to a gallon of gasoline or things like that. I mean, there's very basic bookkeeping and knowledge that we need to get out of there, because the students are going into this world of the next 30 years, which is going to be subject to the greatest change ever. And then, of course, it's research. I mean, we as researchers, we have to come up with better ideas and better solutions. And that's, as we were saying there, that's not just technical. That is also communication and effective bridging with our communities.
Yeah,
So,
and I think
Erica, we have less than 30 seconds left. The time went very fast. But if you've got a thought on what Penn State should do and you can do it in 30 seconds, go for it.
Yeah, well, we've got to leverage all of our interdisciplinary strengths across all of those sectors and support the research that's already happening and elevate it and let people know all about the good research that we're doing here at Penn State. And then I think we need partnerships. We need to partner with, as I said before, communities and businesses and government to really make those changes scalable.
Well, I want to thank both of you. It's a fascinating topic and an important topic. So, and I appreciate you joining me. Thanks.
Thanks for having us. It is a very important topic. We're glad to talk about it.
Thanks for your time.
So, Dr. Barron, as of right now, what are the biggest carbon producers on Penn State's campus? And as of right now, are there any plans to replace them or to slowly phase them out in the coming years? What's the plan there?
No, so the university made a pledge by 2030, and we're exceeding it. So some of the biggest, for example, replacing the coal-fired plant on the University Park campus with natural gas, working with BP Light Source to create what was a year ago the largest solar farm in the state of Pennsylvania. We ended up with about 50% of our energy that's renewable. So you start to look at what's left, and we have a group that's trying to study this component, and you always realize that because of the magnitude of our physical plant, this is a huge part of the energy consumption for the university. But interestingly, if we look at Penn State as a whole, you also have to think about transportation and the fact that many of our employees come from long distances. So this also gives you an idea that parts of this are things that we can work to improve upon, and some of it is going to be quite challenging.
Great. And, as a Penn State student myself, I'm somebody who took courses in climate change education. Is Penn State looking into right now expanding climate change within its curriculum? For instance, would it potentially become a requirement as part of its general education courses for Penn State students to learn and become well-informed about climate change?
So there are more and more opportunities to learn about climate change now coming from lots of different colleges and components. But I would say that the general education requirement is one that is up to the faculty and the faculty senate. And so this takes time, and it has to reach the point where they decide that they're going to add something more than we already have within the curriculum. So I can say this is a great thing to do, but there are actually many, many competitors for space on that general education curriculum. And we don't want to make it longer. So that it does become a challenging issue in itself.
Right. And much of what we've talked about today has dealt with University Park's campus here at Penn State. Are Penn State's Commonwealth campuses factored into the pledge to reduce those carbon emissions by 80%? And if not, what steps are they taking to reduce their carbon footprint?
So from my viewpoint, we're one university. We might be geographically distributed, but when we're making pledges, we're not making pledges just because of University Park, even though it is the biggest. And I have created actually a carbon task force that is looking at all the different ways in which people ask me to make a pledge. I would rather focus on what we can do and the action required. So we have a whole group of faculty and staff that are working together to look at all the sources and what we can do to improve even further than we have.
Great. And, since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its last report on severe weather, we talked about this earlier with temperatures in the summertime perhaps increasing. What should we expect here in State College?
Yeah, so, I always worry about all of the ramifications, but certainly this tier of the country in terms of latitude starts to have significant impacts, probably nighttime temperatures warming. Certainly we have seen already significant shifts in winter temperatures. If you go back 25 years ago, the winters were quite harsh. And in the last 5 years, I really haven't seen a harsh winter in State College. So we already see some signs of what to expect.
Great. Well, Dr. Barron, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Support for Digging Deeper comes from the Penn State Alumni Association, connecting alumni to the university and to each other. The Alumni Association is powered by pride. Learn more at alumni.psu.edu. And from viewers like you, thank you.